Welcome to Millersville Speaker Series, where we bring the best and brightest in to talk about complex business problems. Today, my guest is Steve Dennis. He is from Sageberry Consulting. He's the president of Sageberry. He is a renowned author, and he also is a senior contributor at Forbes. We are in for a treat. Prepare to be provoked, prodded, and poked. We've got a topic today that's, you can't read anything today without tripping over it. It's transformation. And we're going to be talking about how 70% of transformations fail. And Steve's going to let us know about how yours cannot be one of those. So.
That's a bold promise.
It is a bold promise, but I think you're going to deliver.
We'll see.
I wanted to say, I got an advance copy of the book and read through it, and I got a highlighter, and had a pen, and I was thinking, I'm going to take notes and all that. 2 highlighters later, I had a completely yellow book. And I thought, well, I think the whole thing's important, so it's been very hard to boil it down. I'm going to try to do that today. But what I can say is, buy the book. And that is not a plug for Steve. He didn't ask me to do that. I'll pay you later. It was so that I can impress upon you the importance of the material in the book. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. And then you can garner for yourselves how you think you can use this applicably going forward. What I'd like to do is start with the moment that I think was defining in you starting to crystallize this thought. Mm-hmm. You were working for Sears.
Yeah.
And I don't want to steal the thunder of the fun of the line, so I'll let you tell the story of what happened.
Well, I'll try to keep it short. Well, first of all, I started my retail career at Sears in 1991. And a lot of times people ask me how long I was at Sears, and I usually say too long, because had I been smarter, I would have gotten out of there to move on perhaps many years earlier than I did. But in 2001, I was the head of corporate strategy, and we were trying to figure out how to hopefully finally fix the declining department store business. And we had a big team. We hired Bain & Company to help us, all sorts of tracks looking at merchandising strategies, customer experience, just about anything you can imagine.
So, all the magic beans.
All the different things. And we, in fact, evaluated some pretty potentially bold options for, for example, maybe getting out of the apparel business entirely. And so we had a really, really wide purview, and we worked on it for quite a long time. And just to make it a little bit shorter, we had a series of meetings with the board of directors, but there was this one pivotal meeting where we went in and we basically needed them to endorse this multi-year, multi-billion-dollar strategy, put many of these things in motion. And so we went in and we pitched it, and they said yes. And that was pretty exciting. I was pretty excited after all this work, like a year and a half. And I was down in my office the next morning, and one of the guys who worked for me came in, and he had kind of a dour expression on his face, which wasn't uncommon for him. He's not the most, to be fair. John, I hope you're not listening. And I said, what's up? And he said, I've really been thinking about the strategy we got support for, and I really think it's the best we could come up with under the circumstances. But the more I thought about it, it's not a strategy to win. It's a strategy to suck less. And
so
the moment he said it,
a year and a half, lots of people, board approved.
Yeah, and I don't know that John has a career as a motivational speaker, but in a way, the minute he said it, I was like, well, yeah, we are closing gaps that had emerged between us and the competition, but we weren't really leaping to a new place that had any real chance of being powerfully profitable and customer relevant and all these kinds of things. It was really just shrinking the distance between us and the competition. And that assumed we could execute it
right
beautifully, which turns out not so much. But I think that was a starting point for me to really be thinking about how often it's a case where we're kind of innovating to parity. It's one of the terms I use in the book, that we confuse things that have become table stakes with things that are actually differentiators.
Right, getting you to par.
Yeah.
Thinking that's transformation when it's...
Right, when it's really just incremental improvement, which is fine. I mean, you have to optimize things, and I'm not suggesting that's not a good idea. But in particular, so that was back in 2002, I believe, or 2003 when we presented that, so quite a while ago now. But if you think about how the pace of change is accelerated and how new competition comes in from all sorts of different places, it's even worse.
Yes.
I mean, at least we were mainly, I mean, we had a significant e-commerce business and we were investing in digital. It wasn't like e-commerce wasn't important, but most of what was going on was we were losing share to largely physically based
Yes.
retailers. So it was a little different world.
And I'm going to take a quick sidebar because something you made said in the book I really liked about it used to be that your competition was the store around the corner in your category.
Right.
And now it's anybody anywhere in the world.
Yeah, sometimes when I'm speaking to audiences with, and I don't want to make this a big age thing, but you've got
I'm right
people.
there with
Well, if you go back to the '90s and before, if you think about what retail was, well, 98% of all retail involved somebody going to a physical location, seeing what was on offer, maybe getting some sales help, et cetera, picking it out and taking it home with them. That
Right.
was retail. And then obviously things started to shift with the invention of the internet, and so suddenly the basis for competition wasn't being the best relative to the person down the mall or across the street or however far you were willing to drive, right? Which for most people wasn't very, very far. So that's obviously pretty profound, but I think a lot of retailers still have a hard time understanding how much the basis of competition has changed, or at least they think that if they can neutralize, again, this kind of idea of sucking less, like if I can close and I'll try to find more elegant language as I go forward, but trying to close this gap is going to be enough. And I think we've also learned that most companies or most customers don't switch from a brand they really like just because you're the same.
Right.
You have to give them a strong reason. And hopefully that's not all about price, because usually you can't win that's a race to the bottom often by trying to make it all about price.
Yeah, there's something you talk about in your book that I pulled out as a theme as well, when you were shifting from, and this is about differentiation, shifting from the price and kind of the hardcore availability and those kind of things to storytelling and art and all of that. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that, because now the mechanisms for marketing and how you talk about brands and products is so much different and ingested differently. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that.
Well, this is probably overly simplistic, but I think to a certain degree, we're either running an errand or we're trying to have an experience. There's certain things where we're just trying to get something off our to-do list, or we have to do it. And so I think it's funny when people say, "Oh, retail's all about experience." I'm like, nonsense. When I'm buying, I have a headache and I need aspirin, I don't need an experience. I need, So I think that's just silly. But so I think we have to understand the customer intent.
I think I said that myself anyway, so keep going.
Yeah, so experience is more about creating, I think, not only relevance, but emotional resonance with the customer. So one of the things by virtue of the internet, of course, is it's really easy just to do kind of left brain shopping. You have a spec, you're trying to find something, you decide maybe you need immediate gratification, so you run down to the store, or you're willing to wait and Amazon ships it to you or whatever. So there's a whole set of things which are very much based on convenience and getting it off your to-do list. And then there's all the other stuff. And that's where physical retail often shines, because you can talk to somebody, you can try stuff on, put outfits together in a way that's not impossible, but harder
You can
to
walk
do.
around in your decision and go through it rather than it just needing to be transactional.
Yeah, and I think part of what's happened in retail over the last 15 or 20 years, and not directly in your question, but one of the things I talked about in my first book, Remarkable Retail, a lot, but I bring back in this book, is what I call the collapse of the middle.
Yes.
Which is, you have a lot, and everybody says I must have some vendetta against department stores because I worked in the department store industry and I'm trying to get back at them by always picking on them.
You're fine.
Yeah, but department stores are like the poster child for this problem. It used to be you go to a department store because they have a little bit of everything,
right,
all in one place. You know what you're going to get, and it's convenient because of the expectation of what you're going to find. But most department stores like Macy's, JCPenney, et cetera, they're not the cheapest nor the most convenient, but they also tend not to be really special on the basis of customer service or environment or unique product, right? So once you've got, getting back to this, you're in competition with everybody. Once you have all these choices, and it doesn't necessarily matter whether they're a 5-minute drive, 15-minute drive.
Right.
What is that point of differentiation? What is that thing that's going to get you to go to that store or go to that website? And so there's this middle ground where you're neither the cheapest nor the most convenient, but you're not really special in anything else. That's where most of the problems in physical retail have occurred over the last 20 years, because that is just getting hollowed out.
Right.
So you have to really be able to find a powerful differentiator when you are in competition with pretty much everybody in the world.
And that gets to one of your points about, there's distinguished at the price level, right? And then there's distinguished at the very high end level.
Right.
And then you have the middle of meh, or
Yeah.
what was your term?
Yeah, Confederacy of Meth.
Confederacy of meh.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's talk about the middle and what's happening there. So people are trying to transform to create that specialness in the middle.
Right.
And so we know from the McKinsey study that 70% of retail transformations fail. So talk a little bit about why that happens.
Well, fundamentally, I mean, I guess I'll put the extremes out. I mean, there are times where they're poorly informed leverage buyouts or whatever, take on too much debt.
Right.
Sometimes it's just horrible mismanagement. So there are definitely cases where that's the reason that they fail.
Right.
But the primary reason they fail from my analysis is they either don't aim high enough in the change they're trying to deliver, or they move too slowly. So part of the mantra in this book is aim higher, move faster, act more boldly. And so department stores are a great example of this. Just not to beat up on them too much, but they're so easy to beat up on. Department stores have been in decline. Actually, when I was at Sears in 2001, we pretty much had concluded that the department store sector was going to be in decline forever, that there were so many factors, and had nothing to do with Amazon, really. It had mostly to do with the movement of volume off the mall. So in hard lines, I know we have some folks from Home Depot here, but Home Depot, Lowe's, Best Buy, Bed Bath & Beyond, all the category killers, which were largely off the mall. And then in soft lines, you had the growth of off-price and outlet stores and Ulta and all these other kind of players. Right. So there were some fundamental things that were happening with distribution that we thought would not be, there was nothing you were going to do on the mall with your current format that was likely to win back a lot of share.
Right.
So I've been of the view that department stores were going to be in decline for 20 plus years.
Right.
Well, as it turns out, the data supports that. So
Lucky you.
Yeah, it's not my
That's
gift.
why you're here today.
It's not my gift of prophecy, but you think about how much share department stores have lost. They were like 16%, I think, of all retail in 2001. They're now about 4%. And you probably are aware, well, first of all, Sears is basically gone. Many other of the big chains have closed lots of stores.
Or trying to transform.
Yeah, or trying to transform. But mostly, so the error is they're trying to be a better they're trying to be a better mall-based department store. And the problem is, mall-based department stores is not a winning business model.
So they're doubling down on?
They're doubling down on a losing hand, or it's the escalating commitment to a failing course of action. It's one way to describe it. So
they're trying to make something that has run its course the best it can be, even though it's still running its course. And that's a big theme in the book.
Yeah, and I hate to quote Henry Ford because he's a pretty horrible person, but he did say, this bit about, if I'd asked customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse.
They would have never come up with a car.
Yeah, I mean, department stores are an example, not the only one in retail and outside of retail, that have tried to become a better version of something that is becoming irrelevant.
Right, a better dinosaur.
So I think part of why transformations fail is they have the wrong frame of reference to begin with. They're not solving the right problem.
Right.
And it is sucking less, or it is very incremental. So to take it outside of retail, 2 examples I like to use is, if you think about Airbnb and Vrbo, which have captured the majority of the value created in the lodging business in the last 20 years, they're not better hotels. They didn't start and say, well, let me look at a Marriott and, we could have a better bar, or, more comfortable mattresses or whatever. That's the way the hotel business has tried to become better.
Right, better
and
bed,
that's fine.
bed, right.
That's fine, except when a new mousetrap comes along and captures a lot of value. So they're thinking both about what does the customer ultimately want. Like, the customer doesn't get up saying, I want a hotel. The customer wants someplace to stay when they're on vacation or on business or visiting family or whatever, and leveraging technology and a new way of pulling it together. Same story with Uber, right? It's not about being a better taxi service.
That's right.
It's about helping customers accomplish their end goal in a different way, leveraging technology. The key thing, I think, in many of these cases, and going back to my Sears experience, is a lot of times part of the reason why transformations fail is your starting point is is not recognizing the sunk cost that you have. That you've got. I mean, I could tell you at Sears and subsequently when I was at Neiman Marcus, so much of and with clients in the last 15 years, so often the starting point is, well, we've already got this thing that we want to make better.
Right.
And if we start to do this other thing, it's going to compete.
And we've already spent the money here, and we've already
Right.
have the commitment, and we already have the board approval.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'll use Lowe's as an example since we have Home Depot people in the room. but I remember having conversations with, well, we're losing all this market share in appliances and tools to Lowe's, and our response is to try to find ways to get the customer to come to the mall to do their home improvement project.
Right.
Well, if you don't sell lumber, I mean, there's just so many reasons why.
Right.
And you can't operate certain hours and trucks. And, I mean, there were so many things that you were never going to fix while you were trying to be on the mall.
The same thing, right.
So we thought, well, maybe we should either acquire those companies or we should build our own version of that or a slightly different version or whatever. But every single time that ever got to any level of discussion, it was, oh, that's going to cannibalize our department store
Right.
business. And
Right.
some smart aleck person, often me, would say, well, I don't know it's one thing to lose some business, but all the business we're losing right now is to these guys. So we don't get any credit for that. So it's a very common problem
answer.
to try to protect the core business and not be willing to do some of the bolder
To let go
things
some of it.
that might.
So let's go inside the company a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
We're kind of looking at outside from an industry perspective, and let's go inside the company a little bit. And there's the governing body, and I love the phrase of the world doesn't need any vocal bystanders. And you talk about what happens within the company that keeps them from transforming.
Well, there are some practical reasons which I would say I don't have great advice on. I mean, one of the constraints, so I'll use just another, not to talk about Sears so much because it's a million years ago, but people can probably relate to it. Even if during our strategy work, because people will say, oh, Sears could have been the Amazon. You were the everything store, you could have been Amazon. And that's a cool story. It's really detached from reality. But let's imagine that we had figured out, because at that point Amazon was basically selling books and CDs, and
Right.
it wasn't really.
I remember.
Yeah. So people have a little false memories of exactly what was going
We'll
on
start
at
the
that
dream
point.
sequence now.
Yeah, right. But I said, but let's imagine we had the vision to say, well, you know what? There's going to be this business that's unbelievable, which is online only with 300 distribution centers or whatever the heck they have now. Even if we had come up with that vision, we would have had to go to the board and say, okay, we need $50 billion, I don't know, some enormous amount of money.
Right.
And we're going to lose money. We're already losing money, but we're going to lose even more money for the
massive
next
amount of
10
money,
years.
right.
But trust us, it's going to be great. And as a practical matter, as a publicly traded company, there's some options that are not foreclosed. So you do see a lot of times where, and probably Macy's right now, I don't know all the things that they might have pondered, but the kinds of things that might have made a difference along the last 20 years, even if they had come up with them, they probably could not sell to their board.
Right.
Because
right.
of their ownership structure and the way they're financed.
Right.
So that's one reason why transformations fail, is because people won't
There's not an allowable construct.
Yeah, they won't act boldly enough because it's perceived as too risky. Whether it is or not, I mean, the ultimate thing is the riskiest thing is to do what they've been doing, which is just slow, lingering death.
Right.
But there are a lot of practical reasons. But I think a lot of times, and more of what I get into in the book, is how leaders constrain their field of vision.
That's what yes.
And that they're very good at optimizing the business model they have. They have a harder time seeing broader possibilities and letting go of things that have made them successful in the past. I think that's
And that's
the more
hard to do.
actionable.
Yeah, and
piece.
that's hard to do. I feel like we do a lot of, this is the hardest part that I was thinking of when I was reading the book is you have a successful company, but there are some indications that there maybe needs to be some transformation.
Sure.
That's a hard place to be.
Yep.
Because you're successful, but then you need to change. So I think a lot of the time we get tripped up on iterative innovation.
Yeah.
Which you probably don't like those two words together, but but iterative, making the part that's successful better.
Yeah.
But then you're not addressing because you think that's transformation. So you have a couple of themes in the book about that.
Well,
Or people confusing those things?
Yeah, well, first of all, one thing I like to try to make clear, and maybe it's unfortunate that I use the leap language so much, because I think sometimes people read that as, well, you've got to do kind of this bold moonshot, like it's got to be one big swing, and I'm not suggesting that at all. In fact, most of the times you want to avoid getting to the point where
Or it's a Hail Mary.
It's basically a Hail Mary, right? So usually it needs to be a portfolio approach, but it is hard to see if you're not looking, right?
Yes.
So.
Or seeing?
Yeah. Well, so I'll give you one example. I worked with a company a number of years ago where the customer data was really, really clear that we were doing very well with the most profitable part of our customer base, but all other customer cohorts were getting weaker. And if you just sorted your way through that, you'd go, well, eventually this is going to become quite problematic, and you could actually do some modeling to figure out when that was likely to be. But you could argue about exactly how that was going to play out. The problem in that case was the CEO was very well rewarded for how well we were doing with this one particular customer cohort. So it was very difficult for him. He had to basically admit that his baby was ugly. Now, and that's a hard thing when you are, to your point, when you're doing well. It's hard to say, well, theoretically, if we don't change, they're going to be big problems.
Right.
So, but what I see a lot is companies aren't paying enough attention to the data, or they don't accept the reality of what the data is saying, either because they're just in denial about it, or their compensation system is such that, well, that's fine, but I'll be retired, or who knows?
Right.
I'll worry about that.
Right.
I'll worry about that when it becomes a big problem.
When you and I talked about the McKinsey, the 70% of transformations fail, but I liked what you said about the Alex Partners research was more interesting, where 78% of CEOs felt that there was disruption in the past year in their companies, and they didn't really know what to do about it.
Right.
I mean, that is staggering if you think about 78% of CEOs felt disruption and didn't know what to do.
Yep.
So I wanted to talk about, I feel like there's some answers in here of where to start. Yep. I love the questions at the end, but, talking to the CEO base, what do you do if you're in that 78%, which is most?
Yeah, and I don't know how much of that data was or that study's conclusions was affected by the generative AI coming on, because I think that's part of it.
But it's a reality now, so.
Right. Well, I think one of the points I make in one of the chapters of the book is this chapter where I say wake up, which is really to open the aperture of what you're going to look at and dig deeper on what's going on. So, part of the reaction, I think, to things changing very quickly should be to get curious.
Yes.
And so it's understandable. I mean, there's lots of stuff that I don't have any clue what's going on and what it means. And if I'm working on something, a written piece or a speech or something, I try to make sense of it. But a big part of that is being willing to go there, right? And not just assume that your intuition that served you well in the past, or the things that you understand a lot about, is necessarily going to serve you going forward. So I think the first step is to be curious and do the work. The other thing in a lot of cases, I think this is very true of big companies, not all big companies, but many big companies, is to bring in different voices, to bring people in to talk to you about this, or add people to your team, or put money for discovery processes or research or whatever. You have to understand what the nature of the problem is. But if you're trying to understand, let's say, Gen Alpha, if you're in any kind of consumer business, right, that eventually, just demographics are going to be such that these younger customers get older, right? So that's something you're going to need to understand.
Yes.
And I would say, well, I don't know what Gen Alpha customers want.
Right.
But if that were my job, or part of my job, I would want to get in there and try to understand it better.
Yeah.
But then, you have to get into all the so whats. And is there something is this just input that goes on your watch list? Is this something, should you be doing a Roblox pilot or something? Turn it into something, how could you get smarter about it, or how could you become more prepared?
Right.
If you use, for example, a couple of years ago when the metaverse was getting all this attention, right? Everybody's free. Oh, the metaverse. I go to conferences. The whole conference was about the metaverse, and it turns out the metaverse hasn't become a very big thing right now.
Right.
But that's fine. Like I worked on Second Life projects and MySpace projects, and we and we didn't know. I mean, there were people that believed those things were going to be huge,
And you don't know.
and you don't always know,
No.
right? So the key is to try to get smarter about it, and then say, okay, what are some things I could be doing now that would help me decide whether this is just kind of a monitor situation, or is this maybe I need to stand up a few pilots, proof of concepts, whatever.
Yeah.
And then as I become a little bit more knowledgeable, I either go, you know what, this is hype, or
Right.
this is another 3 years off.
Right.
So we pull out. So it's really about finding that culture of experimentation and then testing and learning a lot of times. So if an organization doesn't have any kind of learning map around the key things, and in many cases not actually doing any real piloting or probing, they're probably not. They're just going to end up getting caught at some point.
Right. I'm thinking about, we've had both an AI expert and a metaverse expert right here, figuring out how it's applicable to what we're doing.
Sure.
And speaking of, one of the things, you told a funny story in your book where someone was talking about customer input.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of companies, as I'm looking across, talking about what they do and making it better, blind to what customers are now wanting.
Right.
And you have a great quote in the book about, products are no longer what you're telling customers they are. They're
Right.
what, so if you'll talk a little bit about that. I don't want to steal your quotes.
Well, there's been a real, and this is probably fairly obvious, but if you think, you go back 20, 25 years, the way we, all consumers, customers understood brands was largely, it was kind of a one-way street, right? Brands were talking to consumers through TV ads.
On 3 channels.
Yeah, right. I mean, so it's very limited and it was very one way. Not that people didn't talk, but your influence in terms of purchase decisions. Like because I worked at Sears, we were always interested in, well, how does somebody decide to buy this particular refrigerator or big screen TV or whatever? Well, in the 80s and 90s, it was reading Consumer Reports, right? I don't even know Consumer Reports is even really around today, right? Or maybe you talk to your neighbor and say, hey, didn't you buy a refrigerator? That
Yes.
was
Which
a
one
few
did you buy?
people.
What it was, yeah.
A few people and maybe 1 or 2 publications. Well, now, obviously, you're getting influenced in all sorts of different ways, whether it's news stories or TikTok videos or whatever it might be. So that's also a very fundamental change from a brand marketing perspective that you have to respond to.
Yeah.
So I see a lot of times the companies that are slow to react, they're just not paying enough attention really to the things that matter, and they're not doing anything tangible to try to get smarter about it. Now, it's still hard to figure out how much effort you should put into certain, like I don't have any pithy recommendation about, what % of your budget should be on metaverse or
yeah, right.
something like that. I mean, that's everybody's mileage is going to vary on that, I think, but you've got to be doing more of it. And I see almost no retailers that have what I would call an R&D budget, or if they do, it's quite small. And when I first got into business, I worked a little bit in the chemical and pharmaceutical industry, where that was just part of what you had.
Right.
You have this whole
'Cause it's
portfolio,
baked into how they
the
develop
stage,
it.
yeah, and it was so common of you. Well, we got things in very exploratory stage, and we're not going to put too much money into them until they know they have promise, and et cetera. And some of that it was different because you had to go through FDA, and there was different considerations. But most retailers are operating very close in on the kind of experimentation they're doing, or they just figure, well, if it gets to be big enough, maybe we'll acquire that company, which can be fine. I'm not saying that's inherently a bad strategy.
And you mentioned too, this is something that we do here as well, very well, is using NPS as a litmus, or whether it's to keep a finger on the pulse of what people are looking for. Because I think, as I said a minute ago, I do see a lot of companies hyper-focused on making what they're doing better, instead of opening up and going, is that what people are needing anymore? Is it relevant, or is it the way it needs to be? So are there other instruments you can think of like that? I mean, I know that was when you said you could just ask them.
Yeah. Well, this is a little bit of a tangent perhaps, but it's interesting to me. I've had a bunch of conversations now over the last 3 or 4 months with people as to what's really happened with customer centricity. Because, that's been a thing. People, we're customer obsessed, we're customer focused,
It's
we're
on
whatever.
everybody's wall.
And yet so many companies miss things, or there have been a couple of CEOs, I won't name names, that have gone on investor calls where they've had a really bad quarter, and they said, "Oh, we're going to, our strategies, we're really going to get focused on the customer." And I'm like, "What the hell were you doing?" And how do you say that on national television?
Right.
Like, at least know that that sounds like a really ridiculous thing to say.
Now
But,
we're going to remember who we're.
Yeah, but I think that, maybe there's been this overcorrection on supply chain or technology or something that's gotten away from really understanding customers deeply. So I think some of it is just very basic. I work with one company now that claims to be incredibly, hopefully they're not listening, but I've said this to them.
And don't say
person.
their name; they might be a client.
But they claim to be very customer centric, and what they really mean is they're very customer service oriented, which is true. They're fantastic on customer service.
Right.
They know very little about their customers and why they buy and what their vulnerabilities are. So I mean,
That's a good distinction, actually.
Yeah. So you really have to have a system of understanding why. I'm always about. I think retail at one level. We were talking about this a little bit before. The retail equation is pretty simple. Your results are a function of how much traffic do you get, how well do you convert that traffic, what's the average value of that traffic, and whether
And
you
how
get.
often they come back.
Yeah, how often do they come back, and how often do they tell their friends? And you should understand how you're doing well with every key segment, and what the drivers of that are, and then focus on the drivers. Like I always say, it's pretty simple to do. Most people don't have the information. Even if they say that's a good idea, they don't have the data to do it.
Agreed, and I think you also make the point about the way you did it before is the way you keep doing it because you were successful. But there are new variables now and sometimes new levers, like you just mentioned a couple. Go tell someone, and those are new ways to do it. The title of your book, Leaders Leap. So talk to me about what a leap means. Because you mentioned, and the reason I asked you the question is, a minute ago you said it doesn't have to be a moonshot. It doesn't have to be. So what constitutes a leap?
So when I talk about leaps in this book, I try to distinguish, I guess, two levels in which I mean it. There's the business model leap, which is if you have a business model, as we were talking about earlier, if you have a business model that's not working, being willing to take a bold step to a better business model, which often means letting go of what made you successful in the past. So there's the kind of conceptual leap, strategic leap. But when I get into the 7 leadership mind leaps that I talk about, it's really, those are more specific to how we lead. And I mean, here's one state of the way you lead today, and you're moving to a quite different state. So typically not just incrementally better, not just a better version of what you've always been doing, but doing things in a fundamentally new way, or at least many aspects being pursued.
Can you do both?
Sure.
And the reason I say that is I liked what you had in there about redrawing a boundary or knocking down a boundary. If this is where your business stops, what if you drew the boundary outside? So is there an instance where you could get iteratively better at what you do and add some sort of transfer? Okay.
Oh, I think particularly if you're a fairly big, complex business, you almost have to do that. Like, I wouldn't say, just to go back to the department store example, I wouldn't say, the answer is not going to be, if department stores can be turned around, and I'm skeptical that they can be, but let's say they can be, the answer is going to be piloting something quite different, because you still got to keep the lights on.
Yes.
It's a decision about what you might want to shut down or let go of or sell off or whatever. But when you're a big business that's generating cash flow, you've got to keep the cash flow coming while you're making this move. And that might be a 10-year, it's not all going to happen at once. I'll give you an example. So folks probably will know RH, formerly known Restoration Hardware. They basically bailed on their old format, or started to bail on their old format about 10 years ago in favor of these RH Galleries stores, which was a conceptual and realistic big leap for them.
And massively expensive.
But massively expensive, and they knew just by virtue of how long it was going to take them to roll these out and how much capital they could afford and tweaking it, that's a 20-year journey.
Right.
And they're now in year 9 or something. So they've had a portfolio. Now the mix is now like, I don't remember, but 60% of their sales come from these gallery stores, right? And it's up every year. And you can see companies moving from, say, mostly, manufacturers moving from mostly wholesale to more direct, right? It's not all in one fell swoop for a whole bunch of reasons.
It's a purposeful migration.
Right, but
made that up.
you're really, it's probably a bad, shouldn't use this terminology like A/B testing, but in a way, you're saying, I'm going to have this new challenger sort of business model I'm putting up against my current business model, and so when I open the first version of that, and the second and the third, I'm constantly seeing whether I'm getting the results I want. Now, you still have to figure out the best way to migrate, and that could be pretty complicated, particularly if you've got, like in RH's category, or circumstances, you've got a lot of the old things subject to leases, and all that stuff has to be managed.
And one of the things I say when I'm talking about or having talks about innovation is sometimes companies get mad at a seed for not being a tree.
Yeah.
Because I like it.
I'm stealing that.
You can have it, but it's on. No, what I like about that though is, there needs to be an expectation set by the person doing the outlier, the leap, or whatever it is, on what it does take. Because I think sometimes the ideas are put forth as it'll be immediately helpful.
Right.
And that's a fallacy on whoever's putting them forth, where you have to have hey, the commitment here is going to be 6 years, 7 years, 10 years, 20 years in the case of, and then what that expectation is. And I think that's a miss a lot of the time. I think companies don't put together that type of expectation.
Sure, and I think there's a related concept there, which is, and I've worked on a bunch of projects like this, where it's stated that if it's a new business concept, let's say, that it has to be so many dollars or it's not worth doing. And I think it's important to have a materiality input, but I worked on something a few years ago, which I'm convinced would have become a much bigger idea. But first of all, we screened out a lot of ideas through our little screening process because we couldn't imagine them being big enough. And I remember thinking, there's no way to know really how big this can be, because it's a concept. And we did some consumer research, and whether it's going to be 100 million or 500 million, you don't know. But but the concept we ended up rolling out, even in the first year or two we had it open, we learned a lot about it. So the original idea, it's not a totally different idea, but the way we really originally envisioned that project or that concept ended up being quite different than the way it moved. And I remember thinking, well, how do we know that wouldn't have happened with several other ideas as well?
Right.
So this idea ended up looking smaller than we originally thought. The other ones we never did. Some of what we learned through that experiment made us think that maybe those other ones would have been bigger.
Done something.
Well, now that 3 years had passed, and we couldn't.
Right.
It was very hard to go back and say, hey, you remember that idea we're
going to get that one back.
mothballed? Now we'll go do that. So you got to be really careful, to recognize you're not signing up for like the fully formed version of something because you're going to do a proof of concept,
right?
Or you're going to do a pilot store.
Right. You're learning as you go.
Yeah.
And that gives me a wonderful transition into your term, useful stumble. So if you talk a little bit about useful stumble, which I love.
Well, there's a lot of, most of which you probably heard. There's a lot of talk now about, fail fast, fail forward, et cetera. And so there's part of me which doesn't even want to bring it up, but I think it's so important to realize that if you look at the companies that are most successful in innovation, it's not the case, as far as I can tell, and other people who've studied it more than I have, that they've come up with some magical process to innovate better. Mostly, they try more stuff.
Right.
And so, and the way they try stuff is very well intentioned and managed well. So if an idea is not promising, they kill it fast.
Right.
I worked at a company where we had a pilot that had been going on for 6 years. And being new, I said, well, so what are the success metrics for this? Oh, we don't have those. And, well, why are we doing this? Are we planning to scale it up? Well, it doesn't seem to be doing well enough to scale it up. Well, are we shutting it down? Well, it's not doing that badly.
Was it the sunk cost thing? Like we spent
Oh, yeah,
the
it was
money, so
completely
we're just gonna-
sunk. And I was like, okay, I guess I'm going to have to lean on my economics degree now. But I say that in contrast to one of my clients who's really, really clear about it's very, very easy to get a little bit of money to go do something. But it's very hard to get the next level, or progressively harder to get the next bit of money. And sometimes they
it's
change
novel
things.
at first. There's an excitement. There's a maybe, but then when you realize.
But about 70% by their management, which was coincidentally ties back to this. About 70% of their innovation projects fail
Right.
in that they don't meet their original goals. But a lot of things are gleaned out of them that lead to different initiatives. So I think the useful stumble concept or the failing fast concept, the reason why I like the useful stumble is you stumble, but you actually learn something.
Right.
Sometimes you do stuff and it was maybe worth doing and you don't really learn anything. But I think the best organizations, because they're pointed at trying to understand technology's application, or they're pointed at trying to solve a customer problem, or maybe it's a store or operations issue, or whatever the problem or opportunity is, because they're well-intentioned, it's rare that you do something that you don't get something useful out of
Right.
it. It's just
Right.
that particular proof of concept or pilot didn't play out the way
And
you
that's
wanted to.
okay.
Yeah.
What it does create that I've seen too that's very important is a construct of innovation where you have it's okay and the whole organization understands what's going on
Right.
and then supports it, and I love that. So I wanted to ask you a question about corporate culture and how does culture play into supporting innovation, and how can you leverage it? How does it factor into success or failure?
I think it's hugely important. I somewhat deliberately in this book did not want to go into taking on culture more broadly because it's such a big topic, and I don't claim to be an expert at it. But probably to the extent I really deal with it, I deal with it where I talk a little bit about how often when I'm starting work with a client or doing a workshop or whatever, this works better when it's only. I mean, I've asked people to think about it in a mixed audience. I'll ask people to do it here as well, but it works better when it's just one company, where I'll say, I want to learn a little bit about how things operate around here. Would you say that your culture is fundamentally wired to say yes or wired to say no? And one of the fun things is everybody's expression instantly changes because they all know what they want to be able to say is wired to say yes, but the reality is they're wired to say no, right?
Right.
And
What is
so,
your term for that? I loved it, the Confederacy of No.
well, there's the Department of
Department
No.
of No.
Yeah, and so defending the status quo is pretty characteristic of big companies.
Please talk about that. I love it.
And successful companies. And so that's very related to culture. I think if you're in a culture, or I know if you're in a culture which is reliably been producing innovation over a period of time, there is a bias towards action in that area, and there's probably mechanisms to support it. And the CEO, I don't want to make it all about the CEO, but the CEO typically is determining the direction of the culture. And if failure is held up as okay, and maybe even desirable, then you're going to have a culture that is going to lean into taking chances, being on offense, whatever. I kind of hate to use sports metaphors too much, but and then if you have other, I think it's just really obvious when you go into most cultures, kind of the fundamental leanings.
Right.
And so I think, that's been somehow embedded within the culture. Sometimes it's a new leader. Like if you look at Walmart, which is a company that I've worked with a little bit, but also obviously a company people really know. Walmart was much more wired to say no for a long time. They were very much into optimizing. And Doug McMillon has apparently been able to really inject. Now, I'm not saying Walmart is like the most innovative company on the planet, but when you look at a company that is massive and could be extremely bureaucratic, and it is in many regards. Like I don't know how you aren't bureaucratic when you're that size and complexity. I mean, I think that's just the nature of the beast. I don't mean it as a value judgment either way.
No.
But when you're dealing with a business that is that big, to still be able to get people to be willing to try stuff and to put as many innovations out as they have over the last few years, it's really impressive. Now they're not going to grow at 20% a year just because large law numbers. Whatever that expression is, but so yeah, I think if you don't have a culture that is embracing change, embracing experimentation, it's going to be very difficult to move anything. I mean, it's hard enough as it is. I don't want to pretend that any of this stuff is easy.
No, it's not, and I think it takes courage, and that's something at the end of your book I love. There's some phrases that we'll use for the close of this that I'm not going to talk about now. But I want to go back to Walmart because they're a great example of what we were just speaking about, where there's lots of innovation happening. I mean, lots. They are doing lots of cutting edge things. They were the biggest, most impressive thing at CES, but then they're still optimizing and figuring out how to do things at the base store level until they can implement. I know that they're just implementing the e-ink shelf tags, the price changes, and all of that, and all of that is massive for a company of that size.
Yeah.
So, and we've worked with them for 30 some years. So. But yeah, I watch them actually very closely because, we have such a tie to how they work and how that all starts to work together.
Sure.
So it's interesting to watch a company like that innovate, and then you see some of the smaller ones that can't get out of their own way just on a branding campaign.
Yeah.
We worked with, I'm going to talk around this, we worked with a company who wanted to start to be consumer facing, but the locations they bought were in remote areas because it was an online only. And they're like, well, we're just going to redress the stores and reopen them. And it was like, but no, okay. So it's those kind of things where it goes back to what you said, if we're just going to polish this and call it something else when it needs a leap.
Well, it always seems easier to do this kind of incremental thing, right? Because
safer.
Yeah, it seems safer, right? Mm-hmm. But it doesn't, and sometimes it is.
Right.
But
I'm transitioning you to your safer.
Well, but if you have, again, it gets a little bit back to what problem you're solving for, right? If your business model is broken, these incremental improvements are not really going to get you where you need to get to. So
it's the deck chairs.
Yeah, really. So now sometimes they may be perfectly nice little projects, but don't kid yourself that is going to solve the underlying strategic problem you have. And that's where I think a lot of transformations get off, because they don't fix enough of the real underlying problems.
Right.
They are just kind of doing the cosmetic stuff.
So speaking about that, we have people watching, people thinking about that. We have some people in the room. What are the warning signs? Are there indicators? Are there things that you should be? I mean, I know sales, but are there other things or indicators that would make me go, maybe I should start paying attention more to this or anything like that?
I think there are kind of two buckets of things. I mean, certainly overall, if your financial performance is terrible,
sure,
but you probably already know that. But I think the incremental areas would be kind of going back to what I was saying earlier about understanding your customer behavior. I think every company needs to have, hopefully, a pretty easy to understand and monitor customer segmentation. And for each of those customer segments, you need to be able to understand whether you're acquiring, growing, and retaining, and getting, whether it's NPS or whatever, remarkability from those customers. So if you've got kind of that dashboard that is giving you the data you need, and you have to have some expectation about, like, so for example, in the again, back to the department stores, I can tell you without even, I mean, I have seen some data on this, but I haven't seen, for example, Macy's data, but I would be shocked if it's the case that anybody who could have come up with any acquisition numbers for younger customers that they've ever hit those targets.
Right.
Because the business would be much better if they had. So you need to have kind of these early warning signals, because your the earlier example I gave, a company I was working with, our overall financial metrics looked great, but there was lots of worry underneath the surface,
right,
which took 3 or 4 years.
Indicators.
Yeah, 3 or 4 years to play out, and it turned out that largely what we were worried about is exactly what happened. So you need early warning signs, or at least things that will point you to say, okay, well, if I'm not getting the results, the acquisition or the retention or growth or whatever it might be, or the margin performance out of these customer segments, could be by category if you're a multi-category retailer, then that points me to the right sort of work. So I'd say there's underlying just customer strength,
yes,
or growth that you need to look at. The other piece is really technology. And if a new technology is coming into play, or starting to get one that's been around for a while starting to get traction, then you've got to figure out what the implications are. So
right. And that's
AI
hard
is
to
a
do.
great example.
AI is a great example, but there is metaverse in the wings somewhere around in there, and it's starting to come back into, so it's hard to know what to do with all of that. And I'm going to make our last point so we can, between us, and then I'm going to open the floor for Q&A and online. If we have any questions online, anybody watching, please go ahead and put questions in the chat if you'd like to. The idea in the book about the unremarkable middle,
Yep.
we touched on that a little bit, but I think it is important for customers to try, instead of trying to go after everybody,
Yeah.
really figuring out who that core is and
Yeah.
making evangelists out of those. So
Yeah.
just talk on that a little
Well,
bit.
one of the, and this would be a tiny bit repetitive, but I think one of the things, and at one level you say it's obvious, but people haven't acted on it very much, is that it used to be more the case, if you looked at the growth in the 80s and 90s in particular of retail models, a lot of it was category killer types where, Toys R Us, et cetera. And the fundamental premise of those business models as physical stores was we have this massive selection within a given area at great price. But the problem is then when all that product becomes available online and the access, that advantage of one place to go to see everything you need starts not to be such a competitive advantage because there's just too many other people offering essentially the same value proposition or going after pieces of it. So this whole idea of kind of serving the peak of the bell curve customer with really good prices, the world has sort of settled out into a few players that are really good at that. Obviously Amazon, Walmart, Costco, and then you go down to some of the category killers that are still successful, but most of those that are successful today have a business where physical retail is important.
Yes.
Right? But a lot of the rest of it is really consolidated or gone away. So you have to...
Or fragmented. I've noticed
Or
too,
fragmented, right.
sometimes, there's the all-in-one, but then people, it's their passion point, so they wanted to go to a store that was more completely focused on whatever it is.
Well, I think you've had, so one of my favorite words is bifurcation. I think you've had this bifurcation where the game is sort of over, I never want to say over, because you have, Shein or Temu
Shifted.
that come out of left field to a certain degree. But you've got the big mass players, which, to be successful in those businesses requires massive amount of capital and sophistication. So as a smaller player to try to out Walmart, well, good luck, right?
That's
and
cute. That's
and also they're
adorable.
incredibly well known. Yeah, isn't that cute? Like, don't knock yourself out. But so you've got these players that are about massive, have massive scale, massive scope, low prices, et cetera. And then I think most other categories are becoming more specialized in some
Yes.
way, where they either find, off-price retail is a good example, somebody who's willing to trade off kind of the organized shopping experience for the flea market kind of thing because I really love getting a deal.
Right.
And that
And
happens to be-
finding it.
Yeah, but it's a pretty wide assortment, and so that can be a pretty big business. But then you've got all the niche players that go after, Yeti or somebody going after just the water premium water coolers or whatever.
But even
really, so.
Dyson and high-end brand,
Yeah.
I've noticed that there's like a focus on, because there's so much innovation in each of the spaces.
Yeah, and I think part of what that says is, in a world where, everybody I think understands the mass, search kind of thing, and most of that is still largely kind of what I was saying earlier. It's really about errands. Like there's things I need to get,
Right.
and I want to go get them. When it comes to I really care deeply about X, then I want to find the best X. and if that can be done online, fantastic. If I want that in a physical store environment, then that's going to be
An experience.
a different thing, and that's going to be a very focused. But it's going to be like even going back to the RH Gallery. RH Gallery is very clearly not for 99% of the people.
Right.
Either because you can't afford to shop there or because you don't like that style.
Right.
But for certain, it's like you're using a decorator, but you have a lot of money, and you like the style, et cetera, right? So they've picked a big enough segment to have a multi-billion-dollar business.
Right.
But it's very clear who it's for and who it's not. And I think when you see the brands that are successful today, they're not going after trying to out Walmart.
Everything, right.
They're trying to find a segment and going very deep and doing a strategy that I talk about in the book called Edit to Amplify, where you're really simplifying your communication to the customer. Like if you like this sort of stuff, we are going to be the destination for you. And that sometimes is a smallish specialty business.
But
it
smart
can be
enough to be big enough to support.
well, but it can be, so Tractor Supply, we were talking about Tractor Supply earlier. Tractor Supply is an example of somebody who really figured out, you would think they sell a bunch of stuff you can get at Home Depot or PetSmart or, they're in competition with quite a lot of really big national players. But what makes them successful is they're the place where you get all the stuff that a certain kind of customer wants.
Right.
And so I don't
They've
have to go
curated,
to,
yep.
Cabela's and, whatever. So there's still opportunities to build really big businesses, but it's really much more around narrowing your aim in terms of the customers you want to serve and going deeper, providing
Yes.
a whole range of products and more services as well. Like
Right.
it can be, that's more of a platform kind of business model for some.
Rifle versus shotgun. So that's a lot of conversation. Thank you. It's a lot of insight. And we're going to open it up for any questions online or any questions from the room. Does anybody have a question? Yes.
Stephen, thanks for being with us today. So I was interested in your comments just about retail R&D and how it usually.
Give that to you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I was interested in your comment just about retail R&D and how it tends to lag maybe some other industries. So, and it's probably a function of the industry segment you're in with retail and maybe the margins you have. But maybe share a little bit of your thoughts. What would that ideal R&D budget look like for an innovative retailer? And if there are any best-in-class examples of it that you often respect, that'd be great.
No, that's appreciate the question. I don't think that there is, an ideal number. I think it is really dependent upon what your situation is and what your category is like. The most important thing is that you have it, that it's actually in the budget. I mean, I've seen numbers 1 to 2% in general, but I don't know that that's necessarily the right number. But you have to define what counts as really kind of exploratory discovery kind of work. You have to, put that in the budget. You have to have resources, people as well assigned to it has be some portion of their job. But there's lots of different models. I don't know that any one is really proven to be incredibly successful. Like people have started innovation labs or, venture capital partnerships, things like that, and they've had mixed success. So I haven't seen that there's one model that makes sense. I say by far the most important thing is that the money and the resources are set aside and that there's accountability. It's clear who the people are that are responsible for the various pieces of the program. Because then you have to, because I can tell you, I've worked with a lot of clients and a lot of companies. Well, even last time I was at Neiman Marcus, when I was at Neiman Marcus, I was responsible for innovation. I had no budget. So when we wanted to do new things, we had to go find the money somewhere. Well, one year we happened to be doing really well, and so we were able to scare up $600,000 or something to do something. The next year we were behind and couldn't get any money for anything. And so did we have a continuous innovation process? Of course not. There was no chance that it was going to be successful. And people often confuse, think innovation is like having a good idea, but you can have plenty of good ideas, but if you can't do anything with them. So you've got to be able to set aside enough money. I'd say the other related thing is to have some other flexibility, because you could over allocate too much to R&D because you're not always going to find useful things to spend it on. But then if you discover something that needs to have some gasoline poured on it, you got to have some ability. So some companies will create kind of a discretionary fund that the CEO controls or CFO controls, and some of it can be used for that sort of thing as well as just budget variances. But it's the discipline that's more important, I think, at least initially, than any specific number or specific way of doing it.
I think an indicator there, too, could also be if you've paid attention, as Steve has advised, to the data and what's going on. If there's a trajectory of, 3 years we're going to be in trouble, 2 years we're going to have some problems, you might want to allocate before.
Yeah.
So that might be a good indication or some sort of algorithm. If our risk seems to be going up at X% or whatever it is, that could be.
Yeah. The other thing, just quickly, it's not exactly on that question, but one of the things I meant to say earlier. So the subtitle for my book is Transforming Your Company at the Speed of Disruption. So one of the things to figure out is, what does the speed of disruption look like for your particular part of the world? So there's plenty of industries that are being massively disrupted, and the speed is quite quick. And I always talk about my dry cleaner, which I was like, my dry cleaner, I don't think there's a lot of disruption in the dry cleaning business. I'll say this, I'll go back and there'll be like robots and AI and everything. And I'll have to wear a Vision Pro or something to get my dry cleaning. But chances are that business is not going to go through some massive upheaval. So I don't think they need a big R&D budget at the dry cleaner down the street from me, right? So you've got to be able to understand how how many risks and opportunities. And one of the problems with the title today, it's a little negative, right? But the flip side of disruption is it creates opportunity. So it's not just about defending against disaster or some competitor coming and stealing your business. It's about taking advantage of opportunities. And so you've also got to have that R&D budget to play offense as well as to play defense.
Do we have online?
Yeah, we have a few online questions. I'll give them, the first one that came in was from Michael, who said, looking across the business landscape today, what examples can you suggest that provide us with a good benchmark or example for the lessons in Leaders Leap?
Well, so I put a few categories in there. There's the Walmart type of example of large legacy companies that continue to innovate reliably. Then I think they're the companies that are going through turnaround. So one, which is kind of surprising, and I like this example because it's not a technology example, is Abercrombie and Fitch. That's a company that was in a lot of trouble 2 or 3 years ago, and this is one of my fun retail fact of the year, which is I asked people in another webinar. I said, "What stock has gone up the most in the last year?" And almost everybody said NVIDIA. And I said, "Well, no, this stock's actually gone up twice as much as NVIDIA." And the answer is Abercrombie and Fitch. So, which is a little bit of a function of how terrible the stock was doing. So it's not all, it's not the best example. Like you could drive your stock into the ground just so you could, bring it back up again. But I think that's a great example of a company that is transforming not through some big technology bet or a series of big technology initiatives. A lot of blocking and tackling of understanding the customer, getting focused on executional pieces, merchandising better, marketing better, et cetera.
I use the Warren Buffett method, and I have my 17-year-old daughter here today, and I knew when we'd be somewhere, and I was like, "Hey, do you want to go?" And she's like, "No." I was like, "Ooh, they're in trouble." Because I knew, well, she's not shopping there. Yeah. They're in trouble because that's their target. Do we have any?
We do. Is there anyone else in the room with a question? Or I can go back to online. All right. Hold on, let me bring this over to you.
You've talked a fair amount about the operational factors and the structural factors involved with a business that is struggling with transformation. Talk to us a little bit about the leadership and what are the behaviors or the hallmarks of leaders that lead successful transformations.
Sure. Yeah. A good chunk of the book is much more about what individual leaders need to do. And what I argue, and actually what I was trying to do in the book, was not go back over too much ground that's been covered by other people. There are a lot of very good books about strategic transformation that I would say are more academic in their approach, going all the way back to Innovator's Dilemma, but Blue Ocean Strategy, you probably know some of these books that take a very kind of left brain academic approach to it. But what I've seen is, yes, you have to understand business strategy, and some of the things we talked about earlier, like focusing down and edit to amplify, are important. But what I see as very foundational to being willing to make the changes are, number one, and actually I don't explain it exactly this way in the book, but it's kind of the intersection between where ego gets in the way, where ignorance gets in the way, and where fear gets in the way. And I think those are the three more personal characteristics pieces. Now I think they are the three in the book that I talk the most about. So just quickly on each of those. So I see ego get in the way a lot because it plays out in various ways, but my own experience has been, in terms of the way I behaved as well as people I worked with, is, we thought we had all because we were in charge, we had all the answers, would be afraid to ask for help or be afraid to admit we don't really know what's going on and just kind of fake it until you make it kind of thing, which sometimes you fake it and you don't make it. But enough about me. But a lot of it is also this assumption that what got you here is going to get you there. And I think in a world that's changing very quickly, the odds that what made you successful, and this goes back to some of the legacy problems as well, like you get to be the president of whatever because you're really good at, what you did the last 15 or 20 years in this particular kind of operation. But if the world is changing a lot, those skills may not be terribly relevant. So you've got to be willing to understand your confirmation bias, maybe even unlearn some things or say, I got to let go of some of this stuff because even though that made me fabulously successful the last 20 years, it could actually get in the way of doing what I need to do. So busting through your ego or crushing your ego, as I talk about, is important. Yeah, the chapter right after that, we talked a little bit about waking up is, I think, probably the easiest way to think about this. Some of you probably know this idea of beginner's mind. It's from Zen Buddhism, whereas in the expert's mind, there are very few possibilities. In the beginner's mind, there are many. And I think it's opening the aperture to consider things in a different way. And that the ego is part of that, but some of it is just the willingness to dig deeper.
I love the simplicity of that piece too, because it was pretend you're starting now instead of the legacy that got you where you
Right.
are. It's like if you were starting this company today, what would you do differently than you're already built? And I thought that was a wonderful question. In every chapter at the end, there's questions to ask yourself like that, and I loved that.
Oh, thank you. And then the fear part, I think, is one of the big ones. Is this chapter I call "Safe is Risky," and one is just recognizing, and I imagine we all know this, but the reality is, and I'm not an evolutionary biologist. This is probably obvious, but most human beings are wired to protect themselves, and our tendency is to not do things that scare us. And the most obvious one is like public speaking or things like that, right? So yeah, so that's just kind of how we're wired. So it's not surprising that most people don't. I mean, there's a few adrenaline junkies or whatever, but most of us are going to struggle when we're doing anything that is perceived as risky. So in a leadership context, that's usually, here's a new idea, getting in front of a group and saying, I don't know what I'm doing, or I made a mistake, or whatever. So I think one is just acknowledging that fear is pervasive, but is also the thing that often keeps us from doing what we need to do. So the way that plays out in this book is, you have to accept that we're fearful a lot. You have to accept that we're not that good at assessing longer-term risk. Like, it's really easy. The example I use in the book is, like, I know that if I eat a bad diet and don't get any exercise, my chances of bad health outcomes over my lifetime go up a lot. Like, I know that, but I'll still sit and eat a bunch of French fries and watch Netflix, because in the moment that seems like a perfectly good thing, right? So somehow you have to be able to see these further off risks as being more, present, I guess, for lack of a better term, and act on them. So I've often said, because I do some executive coaching, and I often just center in on it. Let's just talk about, where your ego gets in the way, where your lack of knowledge or your unwillingness to look more widely keeps you from seeing things, and what you're afraid of. And if you can unlock those things, that puts you in a place to be able to lead teams and maybe see a totally new way of doing something. Sorry, that was a longer answer than I really wanted.
So we've got a few more online questions we'll move into, and then we'll come back to the room. The next one is, what metrics do you recommend to show pilot program potential besides revenue?
In general, I mean, again, it's hard to, I hate to give the "it depends" answer, but I would say where you want to start is, I'm sure there's some examples that I can't think of off the top of my head, but I think you almost always want to have customer outcome metrics. Like, you're doing this because you're trying to attract younger customers, or you're doing this because you're trying to get these customers to convert at a higher rate, or give you a better NPS scores or whatever. So, but you should really be specific. I think that's where I see the shortcoming, is usually they're not specific enough. And you have to be mindful of the cost to do it and things like that. But I'd say have them rooted in customer metrics is probably the main thing.
Two in the room. I think I saw a few other hands. Here you go.
As you were talking today, my mind was racing and thinking about all the parallels with digital product. And I come from a very strict digital product mindset. And I would love for you to maybe expand on, how do companies or leaders take huge leaps in combining a retail transformation team and a digital transformation team, and essentially making a phygital transformation team to make sure that
You're not allowed to say "phygital" in my presence. I'm my least favorite word.
Sorry.
Kidding.
To really make these teams work together to just ultimately make a better customer experience, not necessarily physical or digital.
Well, again, a lot of it gets back to starting with the customer, because I started working in the combination of digital and physical in 1999, And even then, I mean, obviously a lot has happened since then, but even back then it was pretty obvious that digital was going to influence physical stores and vice versa. So you have to start with the customer. Like I always say, the customer is the channel. Like I don't want to hear about these different channels because the blurring of the lines just continues to get more extreme. So if you're dealing with the customer, then you have to work back, and it's still not easy to figure out how to get the right balance between physical and digital. And there are different, as you would well know, there's things that operate differently when you're talking about behavior on a website versus behavior in a store. But you should be starting with the customer. You should have desired outcomes for those different customer segments and customer journeys and all that kind of stuff. And you have to look at how digital and physical influence what you're trying to do. And then, I mean, the main thing is not to be competing. I mean, that's I think the biggest struggle with digital and physical is that they somehow seem like they're in competition with each other. But it's not. I mean, I've worked on that literally for over 20 years. And I think if you start with the premise that the customer is the channel, that's helpful, but there's still lots of details you have to work out. Getting customer agnostic channel agnostic metrics is another way, and trying to get your incentives to be better aligned. But they're not all. I mean, there's no one answer to that either. It's not easy, but I think you just have to start with the customer and try not to get into the siloed kind of discussions as much as you can avoid.
Just to double down on the silo, it is shocking the amount of companies I see that still treat it as a separate thing, like shocking, because it's not to the customer. To Steve's point, if you start with the customer, there's no way it should be separate. So,
well, and one way you'll get there, and I'm not. Well, I should probably create a product to sell for this because I keep talking about it. But if you are really paying attention to customers well, and you are understanding what drives their movement through any customer journey, it's impossible for you not to see how, like I was working with one client a few years ago, and they were still convinced that most of their foot traffic was driven basically by their location. Then it turns out that 70% of store journey, I forget the exact number, a very high percentage of their customer journeys, well, this was not for them in particular, this was for the category, started in an online channel, which I thought was pretty obvious that would be true, but anyway. But they weren't doing anything in any of their digital communication to drive people to the store. And they were measuring their online business completely on on-site conversion. So I was like, well, and so they were pouring more money into things to improve on-site conversion and losing customers who never made it through the funnel down to their store. But they just didn't understand it. But so if you're paying attention and you understand the drivers and you see where you're underperforming or outperforming, it's gonna force you to figure out how to manage that better. So in this case, it was, well, we're not spending nearly enough money in digital with messages to drive people to the store. So it was pretty straight. I mean, some things you have to figure out, but it was a very big change. And as soon as they made the change, the business went up like $4 million. It was like that. So you've got to be again. It's like what problem are you solving for?
I'm laughing because Scott and I used to work together on a very big can I say? Anyway, and we're wondering, like, if we could have just channeled you 5-7 years ago, that would have been
Well, if you have a time machine, let me know.
Right.
I'm available to experiment.
right.
We'll move to one more question that came in online, and this, Steve, is coming from someone named Nick, who said that you all spoke together during Shop Talk a few weeks ago.
Hey, Nick.
He is curious what AI transformation you think we'll see in the next 12 to 14 months at Brick or Mortar.
Well, my disclaimer here is the answer is I don't really know. That's the honest answer, partially because I'm not close to being an expert in AI, and partially because I think some of it's unknowable. But I think that where I'm seeing the richest short-term potential impacts are, well, there's a lot of, as you probably know, there's a lot of, what would you call it, routinizing mundane tasks, or so producing product information pages, or that kind of stuff where there is a lot of human intervention. but you can automate a lot of those tasks and just have a human supervise it. So that's some cost takeout, efficiency kinds of things. I think the more interesting ones in terms of customer relevance are going to be in the area of personalization. I know several companies that are quite active in using AI, or Gen AI. They've been using AI. That's the other thing too, is like, well, you got to define your terms a little bit. I'm an advisor of a company that's been doing AI for 12 years. Like, so they just laugh that, everybody's just discovering AI. It's like, well, we've been doing this, but generative AI in particular.
Right, it's always the way.
Or you just put AI in your company name and suddenly you're an AI company. So, so I think personalization. I think search is really going to be transformed quite a lot. I don't know that much in this, like how quickly that's going to happen, but search where you can, instead of saying, well, we had the head of the digital studio at Patagonia on our podcast earlier this year. Earlier this year, and she was talking. So this is something they've talked publicly about. She said, you think about if you go to the Patagonia website, you're going on a trip, and you want to get a jacket or something, and you're trying to figure out what jacket do I need. Well, right now you go in and you type, warmest jackets or whatever, and up would come 6, and then maybe filter by color or price or whatever. But what Angela was talking about was, well, now in the not too distant future, you can go in and say, I'm going to be going on a girls' trip for 2 weeks. I only own a coat that's 12 years old, and is this fill rate? What do I need? What is everything I need for this trip? And then you'll get a recommendation. So it'll act like a great sales associate. Like if you're in there, tell me what you have, tell me what you need, have a conversation with you. Oh, you need these 6 things. I think that's that the power of that.
And then they save that iterative,
Yeah, so I think it's like
I already have the coat, yeah.
It's automating, the way I think about it, I guess maybe from my luxury industry experiences, because we were always interested in, we had like 6,000 customers at Neiman Marcus that had really good personal shopping relationships with sales associates. But for the customer that doesn't spend that kind of money, or for whatever reason hasn't built that relationship, well, how do you either arm a salesperson with the information to be able to do that? This is an old school way of doing it with a tablet or something. But how would you do it really in an intelligent agent sort of way? So I think it seems like it's a really good application of generative AI, but it also seems like it could be incredibly valuable to customers and for companies if you can generate that incremental sale or make it that much speedier or whatever, as well as have customers love it.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good combination.
I think it takes the computing out of the data calculations that used to have to happen sometimes manually, where you'd have to look at a profile and then decide how it goes. AI is going to make it like that.
Yeah.
Like save profiles and then the task. The thing I worry about most is the homogenization of communication.
Yeah.
And that is a mouthful. I can't believe I got it out. But what I mean by that is, even anything you do now, you search, you go, it says, rewrite it with AI. Rewrite it with AI. And you think,
Yeah.
well, wait, I just want Tina to write it. Like I want it to be in my voice. But
Yeah.
then you read the AI and you're like, this is pretty smart. So now, damn it. But what's happening now is you create your own AI voice now. There's people who curate and you load in all your writing and it writes like you and even smarter. So there's all that's going to start happening. But to go back to Nick's question, I think wide adoption would be the automation of mundane tasks.
Yeah.
Some of the communication, even here we're using it, for the note taking and what the after actions are. So all those things are going to free up. And what's interesting about that is that sometimes it scares people because now you're the thinker, right? It used to be I'm so busy. It's like, but are you? Because here's the notes and here's the, so now it's like, no, now you're the thinker. So that's been interesting to see the prevalence of, wait, I might have a little more time if I did it this way, and then I got to think what to do with the time because we're busy.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges, and I do think companies need to be thinking about this right now if they're not already, is if you, I'll use an example outside of retail. I have a couple friends that are doctors that are using AI extensively in their meeting with their patients. And one of the things that one of them said to me is he spends much less time on note-taking and all that other kind of stuff, but he also gets much more help. So he might have his PA have to go look something else or whatever, but things come up right away. Here's 3 things you might want to probe on. He said, so I can spend more time on things that I'm really good at and value-added stuff.
And while
because
you're
I don't-
there.
Right, while you're really there, and more time actually interacting with the patient and building a relationship with them, not doing all this other stuff. So he's able to have, he's just such, I mean, it's early iterations of what some of these tools can do. So I'm very optimistic about how fast things are going to develop. But I think we really need to be thinking about, whether we're talking about our sales associates or people in the marketing department, how do we redeploy their skills and intelligence to really develop more relevant stuff? We'll take out the rote things, and that will affect some people's jobs. I'm not saying that it won't, but I think it will free up. It can unleash a lot more creativity and power. I think that's pretty exciting.
Bring on the thinkers.
We had one quick question come in I think we can get to. Someone asked, what is your podcast and where can I find it?
So was that from Michael?
It's his publicist.
Yeah, well, Michael's my podcast. Well, if it's the Michael I'm thinking of, it's the guy that I do my podcast with, Michael LeBlanc. So it's a remarkable
Well
retail.
played, Michael, well played.
Yeah, that's right. Well, thanks. He's always got my back, my wingman. It's called Remarkable Retail, and it's on all the major platforms. And we are coming up on about 200 episodes, I think, at this point. So that's pretty fun.
Are there any other questions in the room?
I wanted to ask a question.
Wait, hold.
And then I'll do a quick close. I'm looking at the show producer to make sure that's okay.
Steve, I haven't read your book yet, but we spend
Change
a
your
lot.
life.
I know it's going to be life changing. I know it's going to change my world. But the thing that you kind of glazed over a little bit, Tina, you asked a question about it, but we spend a lot of time on who we want to attract. Just like we're dating or something.
Yeah.
But we don't talk about who we really want to detract or
Right.
avoid and how to build those kinds of models. Does it go into any detail about that? Because that's one of the
Yeah.
things I find is the gap. They always they think that everyone is a customer. Everyone is not really a customer in some cases.
Yeah,
because-
I don't. In my first book, I go into that a lot more. In my first book, Remarkable Retail, I do. But no, it's really important. I mean, again, it all comes back to being pretty, and I know this is an overused word, but pretty intentional about the customer portfolio you want to have. And so that is also deciding who it's not for. That's kind of why I like that RH example earlier, because it's really clear that there's customers they don't want. They're not at all trying to get certain kind of customers. So I think any good business strategy, any good customer strategy is very clear about who you want to have be your most loyal and profitable customers, who's maybe kind of helping pay the bills but are never going to be your biggest fans, and who is not there. I don't love the idea of, people talk about firing customers and things like that.
I'm not saying fire.
Yeah.
You just can't service them for
Yeah.
one reason or another. I mean, there are
Yeah.
some people you really can't service. They're not in the
Right.
category to take advantage of it.
Well, and the more powerful I think you are as a brand at what you're good at, you're going to naturally lose customers over time. You don't want to be chasing your tail. One of the things I reference a little bit in this book is what I call chasing or trying to seduce the promiscuous shopper. There's shoppers that only want a good price. They don't really have any potential to be loyal. And companies, again, I'll pick on the department stores, but I know from looking at the data, I'd be willing to bet that Macy's, JCPenney, Kohl's, all those guys have probably 20% of their sales, might be larger, but a very significant percentage of their sales that come from customers that do not concentrate their spending at either one. Like, they would not say that Macy's is their favorite store or Penny's is their favorite store. They're acceptable, but they go where they get the best deal. And, they do help pay some bills, but some of those customers, you're just chasing your tail because you're not really built for them. And if they're only buying, on final markdown, you might say, great, I got to get rid of that product, thank you. But to spend any energy cultivating those customers is largely wasted. So knowing that as part of your CRM strategy or whatever is super important. And then, making sure you're allocating your efforts to those customers that have the potential to be loyal and profitable is always a good strategy.
I'm told that's all the time we have for questions, so I'll send it over to Tina and Steve to give us some final thoughts. Thank you.
Great. One of the things that was in the book that I absolutely loved was two things, more than two. But these two is what I'd like to use to close. It was, nobody really knows what they're doing. And I thought that was interesting because as we navigate unmacheted paths, no one does. You can have that too.
Yeah, that's a novel.
No one really does. But I love the support that's really in the book through the questions and stuff to get you to a point where that's okay. And then the last thing I absolutely loved was, do we really need more time, or do we just need more courage? And I thought that was pretty poignant in the book and loved it. So thank you for writing it. Thank you for being here today.
Sure, thanks for having me.
And thank you all for watching.